Good afternoon. We will go ahead and get started. This is the QRTP bench card training. I am Megan Kearsley and I'm with the Court Improvement Program here at the State Court Administrator's Office. This training is offered in partnership with CIP and other stakeholders involved in the Family First implementation team. This is one of many trainings that will be offered and have been offered. And this particular training will be offered to other stakeholders in the future. So other folks who may be interested should be able to access this information in this training in the future, hopefully early 2021. I'm going to let you know of a couple housekeeping items, and then I will turn it to Ashley and Jennifer to get started. So again, thank you for joining us. We have sent the QRTP bench card and CLE form in an email that you should have received this morning. The bench card is the only handout for this training. And the PowerPoint presentation refers directly to the text on the bench card. Audio and video for all attendees has been disabled for you. To participate, we encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Panelists will be pausing periodically to take questions, and so your questions will be answered throughout the presentation. You can also, if you feel comfortable or would rather, use the raise hand feature to let us know that you would like to be unmuted, so you can ask your question aloud. Sometimes questions are a little bit more complicated and it's easier to just describe them verbally, and we will allow that. Just use the raise hand feature and we will unmute you on our end. Please know that this training is being recorded and will be available online for future viewing. And finally, if we're getting close to the end of the scheduled webinar time, the panelists will continue, even if that goes a little bit beyond 2 p.m. We want to make sure all of the information is shared. But that being said, we're doing that because it is recorded and you can reference the information later, so feel free to jump off if you need to get to any meetings or other obligations. With that, I turn it to Ashley and Jennifer.
Great. I'll start introduce myself first. I think probably many of you have met me. I'm Ashley Chase, a staff attorney and the legislative liaison with the Office of the Child's Representative. But more importantly, for today's purposes, I'm the co-chair of Colorado's Families First implementation team, and have been doing that since that team began. We also have Angelina Callis on the phone from the State Department of Human Services. She is the program manager for Families First, and she is here in a phone a friend capacity. So if there's a question that we need her help with, she has graciously agreed to kind of sit through this and listen and be available if there's a question needed. Typically I can answer many of them, but Angelina knows even more than I do. So thank you, Angelina, for being here. And of course, you know the wonderful Jennifer Mullenbach, who will get us started.
Great, thanks, Ashley. I think I know most everybody on here, but if you don't know me, I am Jennifer Mullenbach. I'm with the Jefferson County Attorney's Office, and I actually hit my 12th year there this month, which is kind of frightening. So, but thank you guys for joining us today. Just want to give you a few things to get us started. Like most attorneys, we have to tell you our disclaimer, right? That's where we always start. So yes, Ashley, especially Ashley and myself too, to some extent, have been working on Family First for about the last 2 years as we've started working on it in Colorado. But there's still a lot to be left decided, questions that we have and that we can't answer. So what we're sharing with you today is what we know now, what we know from working on this. But certainly we will be very honest with everyone that we don't know all the answers. I think Ashley would agree with me when we started this 2 years ago. I think we thought it was going to look really different than it really has. And I think that's still possible before we implement. Other thing we just want to say is we are going to pause after each slide as kind of a natural place for people to ask questions. So definitely put them in the chat as we're going along. But like Megan said, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand at that point, and that'd be a good place to do it. So let's just start with a little bit of a background on this. So as you guys know, or probably know, this bill passed back in February of 2018 at the federal level. And what the bill said was that states could opt into this way of doing business as early as October of 2020, but everyone has to implement by October of 2021. So at this point, Colorado has not started yet. You guys would know if we had. And we don't know if we will start before October, but where we're at this point is every state does have to submit a prevention plan to the federal government before they can start implementing Family First. Colorado did submit theirs to the federal government in August of this year. They have gotten some feedback and need to do some responses to that. So the state is hoping that they will send their prevention plan back to the federal government in January of 2021, and then we will go from there. So for everybody, at least plan on October of 2021 at the very latest that Colorado will be starting this. And I think that's all we're going to do with our introduction. So for some of you, it's probably been a while since we've talked about Family First. So we just really want to review the QRTP part of it, not the entire bill for it. So for those of you who don't know, the QRTP is the Qualified Residential Treatment Program. And if you haven't gotten used to this acronym yet, I swear it will roll off your tongue someday. It's very awkward at first, but I think you can, it gets there. So many of you probably know that what the federal government said is they're not going to reimburse the states anymore for residential RCCFs and for group homes. That what they really said is those levels of care should be about treatment, not about placement, and that we really need to revise what these facilities are going to provide. So this is a pretty big shift, obviously, from the way we've done business for a very long time. So the pieces that are required to be a QRTP is that every agency does have to be licensed and accredited, or every facility, I should say, has to be licensed and accredited. The licensure part is not a problem. Every one of them in Colorado is licensed, but the accreditation is a piece that was a major shift. There are only a few entities nationwide that accredit residential level of care, and the accreditation is both can be pricey, but more important, requires a lot on behalf of the placement entity to be able to meet that accreditation. So that's the first piece. So we know that it's going to elevate the care that our youth are going to be getting. The other piece is that every facility has to have trauma-informed care. And what this means is not every single intervention has to be identified as trauma-informed, but the entire organizational structure has to be trauma-informed, and that all of their treatment is done within that framework. So within the state of Colorado, we have already implemented the rules around this for what the QRTPs will need to provide and show to show that they are providing trauma-informed care. QRTPs, I think as most people know, youth and children cannot go into them anymore just because somebody requested or because we don't have any other alternatives. So now in order for a youth or a child to go, it has to be approved through an independent assessment. And we are calling those qualified independent assessors in our statute. And really what this person is they are not related to the child welfare system at all. They will be run through the Office of Behavioral Health. So they are a completely separate entity. And their goal and their purpose, just like it sounds, is really to make an independent assessment about whether this particular youth needs this level of treatment. And if they do, we need to talk about for how long. And then the other piece that we are going to spend most of today on is the court approval of a QRTP. So I am not going to talk much about that. And then the final piece about QRTPs is that there is a provision in the federal statute that does require aftercare support. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. The one piece I did want to just mention about the independent assessor is they are also going to be using a standardized assessment, which is the CANS tool. And I know Ashley will talk about that just briefly a little bit later, but we do expect that there will likely be more training on that as well.
Absolutely, Jen. So this is the bench card. You should have gotten this today in your email. This is a front and back 2-page document that we hope judicial officers will rely on and use as they're holding these hearings and thinking about how to make these decisions. But we also wanted this to be a tool for everybody else in the courtroom. That way we all kind of hear the same information, we have the same expectations, we have the shared language. And I think this will really make the process a lot easier and smoother as we all get used to doing it. And then as we go through the bench card, we can kind of explain how things happened and where, and I think that will help people feel a little bit more confident in the process and in the tool, as Jen just mentioned, and things like that. So ideally, after all these trainings are done, I think people will have a lot more confidence in this process, and that will help it work out smoothly for everybody. So the training today is actually just going to take the actual snapshots from the bench card. So pieces of the bench card will pop out. We'll talk about where it came from, how to use it, that kind of thing. But nothing on this PowerPoint is going to be found outside of the bench card, just so you know. So that's why you don't have these slides. You just have the bench card itself. And you might want to take notes in a few places. The bench card itself is a product of the Families First implementation team. So I mentioned that's the team that I'm co-chairing. That is a group of professionals from a wide variety of backgrounds, counties, both big and small, state people of the variety of agencies, judicial partners. There are constituents. It's got a nice wide breadth to it. And there's a few work groups. So I'm sure that you've heard us train on this before, but one of the work groups was the QRTP work group to work on a lot of the specifics that Families First requires of these QRTPs and how it's going to work. That work group formed this very small legal team who came up with this bench card. The bench card was then vetted through several committees and stakeholders, including the larger QRTP work group, the bigger Families First implementation team, that the task force has looked at it. So a variety of people looked through this and kind of honed it and perfected it over time. Although, of course, as Jen said, we will inevitably get more answers or things will change, which is sort of the name of the game with Families First. And if that happens, we will continue to update this and use it. So it should always be up to date and valid. There was already a version 2. So this actual picture that you're seeing here doesn't have the v.2, but the one you'll notice that was emailed to you today does. That's because when we were putting this training together, we realized there was a small typo on a site at the second page up at the top. So that has been fixed on the document that you received today. So you don't need to worry about that. So we're going to walk you through this section by section, and Jen is going to start us off with timeframes.
Great. All right, let's get started here. So, yes, as Ashley said, we're going to start with the time frame. So first thing everybody should know is that the dates and the time frames run from the date of the placement in the actual QRTP. Our hope is with the individual assessment, the independent assessment, that our best practice is that it will hopefully be done prior to a youth or a child entering a QRTP. But if that does not happen, then we are hoping that it will at least be done in quite an expedited time frame. The statute does give us, I believe, up to 30 days to complete the assessment, but Colorado is looking at something much shorter. And Ashley, I'm actually going to ask you to jump in here and talk a little bit about the background and how we came to the shorter timeframes.
Sure. So the federal timeframes state that you have to get into court within 60 days. When we talked about this as a group, we thought that just seems too long. If the purpose of one of the purposes of QRTP is to ensure that youth are not in placements that they shouldn't be in, and that these placements are short-term, trauma-informed, treatment-specific type of settings. And so what we did, it didn't seem right to have a youth placed in a QRTP for up to 60 days without even knowing if that was the appropriate fit or not. So we actually in Colorado played around with wanting it to only be 14 days. So you'll see in the timeline, the first bullet says that any placement under QRTP is allowed to pull down for federal funding up to 14 days. So we wanted the time frame to be that short. In reality, after working through it, we realized that probably wasn't realistic, at least at the beginning, that we were going to need more time to figure this process out and get people in and out. So one of our compromises that came out of this is we have 2 different timeframes. So the statute allows up to 60 days in Colorado to be consistent with the federal timeframes. But we did say, you know what, if a youth is in that placement already and the assessment says they don't belong in that level of placement, then they need to get in front of the court within 30 days, because we wanted to cut down the time that a youth potentially was in a placement that didn't meet their needs or that they didn't really qualify for. And so that's why you'll see this initial hearing section has these two different timeframes that can be triggered. So again, it's triggered either if the youth is already in the placement and the assessment says they don't belong there, you have to get in front of the court. Or if one of the parties objects to the placement, you have to get in front of the court within 30 days. There's some talk that maybe those timeframes would be further shortened by rule or best practices. We'll have to see how that plays out as we go along.
Yep. Thanks for giving us the background, Ashley. So again, when we are in a QRTP, every placement in a QRTP has to be approved by the court. And just to let you guys know, Ashley's doing the first day of homeschooling again, so she had to pop out, but she'll get back on here in a second. And what happens is if the court, that when the child is in a QRTP, we are requiring under our statute that it be reviewed again at every placement and review hearing, but at least every 90 days at a minimum. And as we get a little bit further down here, we're going to show you why we're really sticking to these tight timeframes, not only because it is about treatment and short treatment, but the federal government has also put some general guidelines on how often a youth in general or throughout their lifetime can be in a QRTP. So again, if the placement is not approved by the assessor or by the court, then we have 30 days to transition the youth out of that QRTP. And then where we're at is, so here's the pieces about the youth. These are divided by age. So looking at youth or juvenile who are under the age of 13, and this would be under the age of 13 at the first time that they ever went into a QRTP. So they may be 15 or 16 at this point, but this time frame would apply because they went in when they were 12 and a half years old. So what it says is after 6 months of either consecutive or non-consecutive time in a QRTP, and again, this is a QRTP over their lifetime, not just that one specific placement. Any continued placement requires the approval of the director of CDHS. And so that is actually the director of CDHS, Michelle Barnes herself, is going to have to approve all of those placements. And then we report back to the federal government on why we're going outside of those timeframes. For juveniles 13 and older, it is a little bit different. They do break it up with 12 consecutive months. So again, that would just be this one specific placement. But then again, over this youth's lifetime, they can only be in there for 18 non-consecutive months, again, unless they get approval of the director. After discharge from a QRTP, there is a federal requirement and that there is 6 months of aftercare provided to the child or youth and their family. The QRTP does not necessarily have to provide that themselves, but they are responsible for the coordination of finding the 6 months of the aftercare and ensuring that it's all set up. We are going to talk about a little bit later what happens if the court does say that the youth needs to stay in a QRTP, even if the assessment does not agree. But the only piece I want you to think about that for right now is if that does happen, we stop receiving federal funding after those 30 days, and then the state and county has to pay for the placement. All right, so the initial QRTP placement. Again, these this is going to start from each time that they enter a QRTP. This isn't the lifetime, but just this specific placement. These are the things that we want you to be thinking about prior to that first hearing. We want the court to be thinking about prior to that first hearing. These are probably going to be questions that you're going to be asked, so you need to be prepared with the information. First one seems pretty obvious. What's the placement date? How old is the child? Because that's going to trigger the different time frames. Everyone who takes over a new case is going to have to know what this child or youth's history in a QRTP is, even if you haven't worked with them before, again, because of those maximum time frames. If you are seeing that you're getting close to the time frames or have already exceeded them, we're going to have to make sure to get that approval from the director, hopefully in advance. The state is working on a procedure on how to get this approval. So the counties will learn that as we implement this, or before we implement it, I should say. You do want to check and see where are we at in terms of that assessment being completed by the qualified individual. Again, we're going to have to keep track of those time frames. If it hasn't happened yet, how close are you to your 30 days? And then it's everyone's responsibility, especially the county attorney's responsibility, to make sure all the proper timelines are being met and that we're filing things with the court. The other piece about this that is new for us and new, I guess, for everybody is the QRTP assessor and the agency, the child welfare agency, need to make sure that a family permanency team is assembled. And this is something that is required under federal law. So what it says is this is going to include people who are appropriate family, relatives, fictive kin, professionals or resources that the family identifies, like potentially a teacher or their clergy or a therapist who has worked with the family or the kids before. The other piece that's really important is that youth 14 and over absolutely have a voice in this. And so we need to make sure that we're including, to the extent that it's possible and appropriate, team members that are selected by them. And I think we could probably all agree best practice is going to be to try and do that even with youth under the age of 14, but it's definitely a requirement over the age of 14. And then the other piece, oh, yep, Ashley's got it there, is that the federal law went out of their way to make sure to say that these have to be convenient for the family, not for the professionals, not for the QRTP facility, but for the family. And that includes both the time and a place. I think our practice has really shifted to doing this anyway, but I think it's just a reminder on how important that's going to be for this process. Ashley?
Well, I forgot at the last slide or two to stop for questions. So let's make sure we don't have questions before we go on.
Good point. I'll just keep talking right through everything. So
I know, I was all excited. I was like getting your vibe and hitting forward and forgot to stop for questions. So I'm not seeing any at this point. So I just want to make sure if somebody wanted to, raise their hand that we aren't missing them. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll keep going forward here. So as Jennifer talked about, this independent assessment is going to be a really important piece of this process. And there's a lot that, was laid out in the Families First federal legislation, as well as some of the work that we've done here in Colorado. So these are kind of the requirements of what the individual assessment must have in it. Again, we want professionals to feel like they can rely on these assessments because it's such a crucial piece of this process. And so I think it's really important for all of us then to understand what goes into it, to make sure the assessment we're getting actually has done the things required. And that way we can all have some shared understanding and trust in the document. As I mentioned previously, Colorado has selected a tool. So with this, you have this qualified individual who's going to be the person doing it. They have some requirements of them, and then they have to use this validated tool in order to do this assessment. So there were a lot of tools bandied about in Colorado. The tool that we decided on, and again, went through many levels of approvals and process, was the CANS. Some of you in some counties are familiar with this and have used it. I know others have used different tools. There were quite a few reasons why the CANS ended up being the tool that was picked. It has been normed for a variety of communities, which seemed very important for Colorado and everybody. There's also quite a few states, surrounding states, that use the CANS as well. So that's going to enable us to do some interesting data collection and comparisons with other states when it comes to outcomes and things like that down the road. CANS is something that's very compatible with some of the other assessments happening in the state. And so I think most people are feeling pretty good about it. Dr. Lyons is the creator of this particular tool. He's been working with folks in Colorado on really tuning in our algorithm and making sure we're testing it and that it's working here. So that is the tool that we will have. As we mentioned, the tool has to be administered by the qualified individual. So there has been bills passed the last two legislative sessions about Families First. The most recent bill was Senate Bill 2162, and that added a definition of the qualified individual, as you can see here. So this is in our definition section in 19-1-103. And, this really laid out that this couldn't just be like a GAL coming in and applying this tool, or somebody from the county side. It really lays out what this qualified individual is. Some of, I think, the really important things when it comes to the judicial process, to remember is that they cannot be an interested party or participant. So they really are a neutral outside professional who's qualified, who does this, so they don't have any skin in the game, so to speak, which I think, again, lends to the credibility of the results and the tool and that kind of thing. So that sort of is all laid out here. Sorry, I should have drank a little extra water before we started. I was telling Jen and some of the girls helping us with this that it's the first day of homeschool here. So my voice is a little hoarse because I've been teaching kindergarten all morning. This is much more interesting. The assessment has to determine and include these things here. So you'll see these sort of small bullet points here. This is everything the assessment has to do. So the assessment is not only the tool, it's the tool plus some other things. And like Jen talked about, there has to be this family and engagement, this permanency team that's engaged and part of the process. They have to really consider the use and needs, if they can be met in a non-QRTP setting. That may change depending on where the youth is located. There may be services in some areas that aren't in others that may change how this looks. This child's specific short-term and long-term goals really have to be considered. There's collateral information, there's placement preferences, you have to think about siblings. So these are kind of all of those things you consider in addition to this tool to come up with the full assessment. The child and youth should be interviewed when possible or appropriate. So that's why this is in here. Obviously, there are some youth, I mean, there shouldn't be too many youth that are too young if we're talking about a QRTP level of care, but that's possible. And so that's an important consideration when you're thinking about what's happening. And one thing that the federal law does lay out is if the family does not agree with the recommendation, the reasons why the preference of the team or the family were not recommended have to be included. So if the assessment sort of disagrees with what the family wants, then you're going to see a sentence or two about that in the assessment, so everyone will have that information. Any questions about this piece? We have a quiet group here today. GAL's pounding me with questions. You guys are so much nicer.
So Ashley, wait, let's see. Before you move on, I actually have a question for you. Can you talk a little bit how it's going to be managed through OBH and the ASOs, just to give people a little bit more background?
Yes, good point. So in how this is going to work in Colorado is that this individual assessor is going to be, we call them ASOs. Oh my gosh, I forgot it again, Angelina. She told me last time what that stands for. It's something service organization, I think.
Administrative Services Organization.
Thank you so much. I forget that every time. I got to write that down for next time. So the ASOs who will be managing these assessors. The assessors are going to be available across the state. So you can imagine that takes quite the coordination. The ASO will be overseen by the Office of Behavioral Health, so OBH. Now, the Office of Behavioral Health is technically, under the State Department of Human Services, although they are sort of an independent branch of it. So that we did have to get permission, or that has been approved. The way in which this is set up will ensure their independence. And so this was structured after some other programs through OBH that are independent, operate that way. And so we're modeling it after that. And I think because that's happened before and they've maintained independence and that's been kind of looked at, that's why this kind of passed muster as people looked at it. Any other questions on this one? All right. Then we will move right along to the findings, kind of the meat and potatoes of the bench card and the process, since the court approval is required here. So on the first page, you'll see the required findings by the court. These are sort of the general findings. So these are laid out in the federal Families First. These are laid out in statute in Colorado at this point. And you'll see some of the buzzwords that shouldn't surprise anybody because we talk about this a lot, but it's the most effective, appropriate level of care, has to be that least restrictive environment, and it has to be consistent with the permanency plan. Now, obviously, with that permanency plan piece, if you have a youth that was placed in QRTP at the initial onset of a case, you may not have a permanency plan within that 30 or 60-day time frame. So it does in the statute in Colorado say, and you'll see in some of our findings, if a permanency plan has been made. So obviously, if there's not a permanency plan, that part, I mean, you'll have to kind of, skip over. So it's not as easy as just having the findings though. So this is on the second page of the bench card, and it has different boxes because there are different scenarios in how this is going to play out. So the first column of boxes is when the court is approving or ordering the QRTP. But the top left then is when the court approves and orders the QRTP and the assessment recommends it. So everyone's agreeing and you're in the top left box. If the qualified assessment does not recommend a QRTP and the court is still approving and ordering it, you're in that second box in that first column. And then vice versa, the second column is when the court does not approve the QRTP or does not order it. And the top box is when the assessment recommends it, so they're not in agreement. And then the bottom right box is when they both agree it's not appropriate. So you kind of have these 4 different scenarios and the corresponding orders that go with it. Something kind of important to point out here is this deviation language. So you'll see in the boxes where, well, first, let me scribble this out because we're not talking about youth services yet, though we will. You're gonna have to hold your breath for that exciting topic. If you're gonna deviate, then there was this part that was added in the bill that we just talked about that just passed this last session. So obviously we can't stop the court from deviating, but it was really important to counties and to other professionals involved in this that there was kind of this great weight given to the assessment, that if we go to the process of having this really, robust assessment with this validated tool and this qualified individual and it's independent, that ideally we're going to follow that. Now, we all know, those of us, all of you are in court a lot, that there's always that exception to the rule. Or, the court has to have their judicial autonomy. There may be times when a county disagrees with the findings, or maybe somebody doesn't think the assessment was done the appropriate way. So, you have to have the ability to deviate. But if you are going to deviate, the statute now does say that you have to give great weight to the recommendation. And if you deviate from the recommendations, you have to make specific findings of fact. So those are set forth in the statutory set here for H. And there are just a few of the, I think there are 4 areas that you have to make the factual findings on. So it's like, was the protocol followed? What are the strength and specific, treatment or service needs of the youth and family, expected length of stay, placement preferences, and things like that. So the court's going to make a pretty robust factual finding if they do deviate, which I think will be important so that everyone knows very solid on the reasons why. If there are issues in the process, those can be rectified going forward. Deviation ideally will not happen very often. So I think it's good to have a nice record of why this is going to be such an exception to the rule and that kind of thing. Any other questions about the findings part here?
Oh, we actually have a question in the chat. When do the rules go into effect? And then will it be retroactive to youth that are already in placement?
So when we do opt-in to Families First, the youth that are currently placed in QRTP or other settings that are not supported by the federal legislation will be grandfathered in. So everyone from the state and counties and people working on the team have been very clear that this should not disrupt placement the day we implement. So whoever is there is going to be grandfathered in, and there's going to be some more guidance coming out of the QRTP group around that sort of grandfather clause and what it means. Now, if you have a youth in QRTP and they're getting ready to step down from QRTP, they cannot then step down into a group home or another, they cannot step down into it and pull down federal funding, I guess I should say. Counties always have the option of paying out of pocket for whatever placements they want. This statute obviously deals with what is reimbursable, what is 4E eligible and that kind of thing. But the idea would be if they have to move, then you have to follow, the new legislation and the purposes. If they're in, then they can stay in and be grandfathered in for as long as they need to be in that setting.
And then just going to the other part of the question is, when does this go into effect? That is one of the answers we don't know yet. What we can tell you is the latest will be October 1st of 2021. And it won't be before January of 2021. So it gives you a little bit of a window there. And we will obviously do a lot of bulletins and information about when we are going to go live. So everybody will at least be prepared it's coming.
And for those that hadn't heard, we were intending on implementing already. One of the reasons that we delayed implementation in Colorado is because there was this issue about QRTPs and making sure we had some of those available placements, because there was the issue. I don't know, Jen, how much you guys have talked about this in county attorney circles, but there was this issue of being designated an IMD and that impacting your Medicaid funding. That's something that we have been working on diligently. The State Department has work groups working on that currently to kind of fix that. But that was one of the major reasons why we delayed implementation. That, coupled with sort of how COVID impacted state budgets, kind of tied our hands a little bit. So that is why implementation did get pushed out.
Yep. And Ashley, we really haven't talked about IMDs, I don't think, kind of broadly across the county attorneys. Is that something maybe Angelina would want to give a brief, if you can be brief about IMDs, just to give everyone some background on what this challenge is?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to do something super brief. And then I'm also going to put quite a few links in the chat so that folks can do a little more research on their own and read through and watch some videos that we've posted on the Co4Kids website. So essentially, the Institute for Mental Diseases is the IMD acronym. And it's a law that Medicaid has had on the books for many, many years. But with the change in sort of the new creation of this level of care, QRTPs, states are finding that the creation of QRTPs conflicts directly with IMD rule, which essentially lays out what sort and type of facilities are considered to be institutes for mental diseases. And if an institute or a facility is found to be an IMD, then they no longer receive Medicaid funding. And they no longer receive Medicaid funding for those clients served there. So for child welfare and these placements in residential childcare facilities, that potentially means for the state of Colorado a loss of about $20 million. So obviously we want to avoid that. So there's lots of work happening at the state level in bringing providers and counties together to have conversations around how can we transition from residential childcare facilities to these QRTPs, so that we have placement resources for youth that are not only just meeting the requirements, but also, of course, meeting the needs of youth in this much more appropriate way. So like I said, I'm going to put a bunch of links in the chat, and I know Megan has some stuff and Ashley has some stuff. So I'm sure we can bring some things together to send out to everybody.
Great, thank you. And Ashley, you're probably gonna say the same thing. This has been obviously a major complication, and I think something we didn't see coming. So that really has been a piece that everybody is trying to come to a solution on, that other states are also struggling with as well. And we do have another question. How many independent assessors are there anticipated to be statewide? I don't know the answer to that. Do you, Ashley?
I don't know a specific number. I know that they are aware of the need to cover the state. And so they're doing some testing and some number crunching and data to make sure they have enough. Some of it they couldn't decide until we had settled on our timeframes, because you can imagine if we had to have it back in 14 days, they were going to need a lot more assessors to be able to turn it around in such a small time frame. So now that they know the amount, the time frame they have and that kind of thing, they're assessing the need through various data mining projects and things like that, so they can get an idea of what the need is. So we don't know the number yet, but they're working on making a very, educated guess, or a very numbers-based estimate on what they're going to need, and that'll be part of their request. They have gotten some money to start the program, and they're going to need more, and they're figuring that out as we go.
Angela, oh, go ahead.
1 second, mention on the IMD issue too. There are some RCCFs who are resistant to this, and that's, that the state is working through that and that kind of thing. There are other RCCFs who are embracing this wholeheartedly. Like, if anybody has seen some of the information coming out of the Tennyson Center right now and some of the big changes they're contemplating, they're really embracing this and saying, you're right, we need to do this in a better way. So I think that there may be some growing pains. I mean, I know that there will be some growing pains, But this is really going to be much better for children and families. And there are some providers getting on board. And so it's been a little bit slow going, but I think that it's starting to pick up momentum, and there's going to be some really good solutions in place prior to this being implemented.
Yeah, Ben, Angelina, you took yourself off mute. Did you want to add anything about the number of independent assessors or anything else?
Yeah, I just wanted to say the current plan, at least for the first year, is to utilize the current ASOs that are divided out by region. And then like Ashley said, the idea is sort of to get, a better understanding of, do we need more or are those covering sort of all of the needs? So I'm going to put another link in the chat. Sorry, I'm pretty link happy, y'all. So that is just straight to the CDHS website, which will show, or the Colorado website, which shows you the regions that our ASOs are in. So for folks who may not know or work with them, that might be a nice little resource.
Great, that'll be really helpful. Thank you, Angelina. And we have another question. When do the QRTP lifetime calculations begin? So these will begin from the date of implementation of Family First, and it will be based on, again, the age of the child at their first QRTP placement after implementation. Right, Ashley?
I think so. You know what, Jen, I was trying to look the answer up when you mentioned that before. I'm not 100% certain that you are in the under 13 category, like in perpetuity, just because you were in QRTP once before you were 13. I need to get an answer to that. I think I have definitely heard people say that and then realized that I've never followed up. So I certainly agree that your timeframes for QRTP are going to start the day of implementation. And so obviously the age they're at that time will apply, but I'm not entirely sure that if you're placed once before 13, that after you turn 13 and need a later placement, that you don't fall into that second category. I think that's something I'll need to clarify and follow up on.
Okay, and if I am wrong on that, which is entirely possible, we will make sure to correct that information.
Right.
All right, I think that's all our questions at this point. You want to move on to the next one, Ashley?
See, they're warming up now. So now
I know, finally.
Okay, I'm finally awake. Woohoo! This was after lunch. Maybe that's the problem. So here's the other, Colorado, we're always so interesting and different. Here's one of the other unique things about doing this work in Colorado is that the way in which, you all know this, the way in which we deal with juvenile delinquency in Colorado is much different than many other states and the majority of the rest of the country. In Colorado, they do QRTP, Families First, does apply to our juvenile justice population. That was part of the discussions at the beginning. The Department of Youth Services had a lot of conversations about whether they were going to opt into Title IV funding or not. They are. So the QRTP does apply to this population, although obviously it cannot be in the same way when you think about a youth who's being committed, for instance. There are a lot of other rules and statutes and considerations that apply. But when you're talking about, youth being placed into a QRTP, like pre-commitment, or you're talking about maybe a committed youth, they're looking at stepping a youth down to a QRTP, then the assessment and things like that are going to happen. And they are going to follow some of those rules. So I put this, back to this initial QRTP placement, which we already talked about, because there's this little asterisk here. And we kind of ignored it the first time, but it's because it's really dealing with our juvenile delinquency population. So obviously not all of our youth in our juvenile justice system have an open and active case. So there needed to be a way in which you could do this QRTP process and not have this youth in court. I will say, however, if a youth has a court case, we want this to be done in court. Court is absolutely the preference. It needs to happen in front of the judge as often as possible. There are situations where that's not going to be the case. So the administrative review division will be the approved division who can do this, in place of the court, much like we do some of our other reviews and things like that. So it can only happen, this initial hearing part. So we're not talking about the reviews, but this initial hearing, that can only be done by ARD if the juvenile is committed to the Division of Youth Services and they're no longer under the jurisdiction of the court. So if you have a DNN held in abeyance, you'd want it to happen in the DNN. If their case is still open because they have other cases, again, things like that, you want it to happen in court. But if you don't have this youth under the jurisdiction of court, then ARD can do that same initial hearing process for the youth. Then when it comes to the reviews, the QRTP reviews, those may be held as ARD reviews rather than court if parties consent. So all the parties would have to consent to that in order to have ARD review it if you're in a case where there is court jurisdiction. And then obviously for these juvenile justice youth that don't have a court case, ARD would do those reviews because the court would not be an option. So just wanted to point that out. That is in the bench card kind of down at the bottom on that first page so people understand where that's coming from.
And Ashley, if I could, oh, sorry, if I could just jump in, I just want to, I think you made it clear, but I want to reiterate it, is this also applies the second part of this to active DNN cases as well, not just JD cases or when they're committed to youth. And the reason that we built this in there, it was a long discussion around this, but we just weren't sure what the resources would be, particularly in our rural jurisdictions, for the courts to be reviewing these timely. And so we wanted to make sure that this backup option was available. So sorry for the interruption, Ashley, but I just want to reiterate it.
What this ARD process looks like is currently being worked on. So there is a small group with the head people at ARD, I'm not sure what they're called, that are working on what this process looks like and how they're going to incorporate what's required of the court into their process. So we don't have all the answers on how that looks, but that is under, it's in progress, under construction, and we will keep people updated as it happens. For those of you that do end up in JD court quite a bit or follow this juvenile justice kind of changes lately, you'll know that the Juvenile Justice Reform Bill happened, and that bill itself also requires quite a bit of assessment. So I just want to be clear that the CANS assessment for QRTP is still required. However, there are other assessments for this juvenile justice population that will also, inform decision making. Now, we have formed a juvenile justice work group out of the implementation team to kind of work on some of these really unique issues to our juvenile justice population. That includes some people that weren't in our initial implementation team, like probation officers and things like that. We made sure that these two work groups have shared membership. So people working on juvenile justice reform are also on the juvenile justice work group for Families First, so that they at least know about these assessments and can try as much as possible to make sure that they work well with each other and how you're going to use these different assessments so that it can be a good experience for the youth and we can get the right information. They haven't figured that all out yet, but we do have the membership there to ensure that that is happening. I think it is important to remember that commitment is not placement. There are other rules and statutes at play when it comes to committing a youth. So the CANS, you couldn't have a CANS that says you don't belong in a residential level of care and be like, oh, you can't commit them to this specific facility. Those are different things. The CANS isn't going to trump the commitment or the sentencing guidelines or what the judge is doing for sentencing and that kind of thing. One thing that's, when you think about commitment and Families First, if you go back to some of our Families First 101 training, you'll remember that the federal government wanted to track whether or not implementation of Families First increased youth going into commitment or committed, or just into the juvenile justice system in general. So that is a report that will be due in 2026 for every state. But obviously, in order to get there, you have to start now thinking about how you're going to track that or how you're going to look at it. So our groups have thought about that. And one solution or one small step was also included in that bill we talked about that went through the legislature this past year. And that's that when a court commits a juvenile to the Division of Youth Services, then they have to make a specific determination about whether lack of available placement and appropriate congregate care was a contributing factor. So the idea is that if they make these findings now, we'll be able to go back, look at those findings and, track numbers and that kind of thing. And it'll give us some good information about how this is impacting our juvenile justice population.
And if I can just add to that, I think it's clear, but we don't want the court to be making that finding, right? Okay. So it's not just, cool, yes or no. We really want it to be no. And if courts are doing that, I think that's a discussion we need to have with them about is that what commitment really is for, or is it one factor you consider? I just think that's a discussion we'll want to keep an eye on and be sure to talk about. It's an important decision they make, not just a box they have to check so that we can track statistics.
And I think if the court is making that finding, then the team really needs to go back and think about what we're doing in order to avoid that happening, on a regular basis, because that's, like Jen said, not what we want to see happen here. That's not the intention of this. So I know the juvenile justice population is complicated. That's just kind of a little overview. Are there questions we can answer about this particular area? There are certainly times in families' first work when you talk with other states and things like that, and you think between being state-run, county administered, and how we do juvenile justice, like this implementation in Colorado gets much more complex than it is in some other states. All right, so we're going to talk about reviews. So again, I just took this straight from the bench card. So we already talked about youth services. We're going to get rid of that. And we're not going to talk about discharge quite yet. We're just going to stick to the review process itself. So once your youth is in the QRTP and you've had your initial hearing and the court's approved it, now you have to have those reviews at least every 90 days. So you should review it every time you're in court. If you're going to court regularly on another docket or whatever, review it, great. But it has to be at least every 90 days. So you can't go longer than that. And it should be combined with other types of hearings, review hearings, permanency planning hearings. The point of that was that we're not trying to create a new hearing type and added work for everybody going into the courtroom and the judges and staff. You know, the idea is that we're in court regularly enough in these cases. You add this on to one of those hearings. And if for whatever reason you're not having those hearings every 90 days, you just need to schedule it sooner. But ideally, it shouldn't add a big workload. You should be able to kind of seamlessly add this into some of what you're doing in court already. It's interesting because the federal law, Jen and I have talked about this before, the federal law required departments of human services to provide all this information to courts about QRTPs, but it didn't actually say the court had to do anything with it, which was interesting. So in Colorado, we just wanted to make it clear that we think if the department is giving this information, that the court should in fact review it. And this is the information. So that's where these bullet points come from. This is the information that's required to be provided. We want to make sure the court is reviewing that at, no less frequently than every 90 days. There is another section that was added to 19-1-115 that kind of details, the evidence required. That was added again during this previous legislative cycle. But some of the requirements here is, again, we're always talking about how long have they been there, and we have to start discharge planning from the beginning. And that's separate than the 6 months of aftercare services, but we really should be thinking about discharge from the beginning because these are supposed to be short stays, very get in, get out, targeted level of care. And we need to be thinking about what discharge looks like from the beginning rather than scrambling at the end, so that when we think about that aftercare, everything is seamless for the family and it's all working in a trauma-informed way. You have to always make sure it's consistent with the short and long-term goals. So you're really trying to just not, you don't want being QRTP to just be habit, or you're not really critically thinking about it at these reviews. You really want to be thinking about those goals, the strengths and needs of the child. Obviously, from your initial placement to your first review, that may change, or you may discover more, or they may, some things may be really working for them. So that should be something that's updated regularly and changing. And then you have to really keep this idea in mind, like maybe the youth is getting treatment, but family is also getting treatment. Because remember, prevention service is a big part of this. So even though youth is making slow progress, maybe aunt and uncle are making quick progress. And so now these two needs can be met outside of QRTP. So there's just a couple of different things that you're tracking and looking at, always thinking about how to get that youth in that most appropriate level of care. And then there's this, there's specific efforts. You have to lay out like what specific efforts are being made by the agency to prepare the youth to return home or to a relative. So you're always thinking about it. I think there's going to be a lot of push for this over time. I mean, I know you want to push this anyway. You all don't love paying for these placements and keeping kids in these placements, but it's really making it so everyone in the courtroom, is thinking about all these things each time you come in for those reviews. It's also important to remember that at QRTP, you have to facilitate family and sibling participation and contact, but not only that, they have to be included and integrated into treatment. So it's two pieces there that are really important when the youth is in QRTP. So then once you have those reviews and the youth has been in the system, then, the last piece that I think is one of the most exciting pieces is that once you discharge, the work is not done. So the QRTP placement is required to provide 6 months of aftercare services, and that's required for a minimum of 6 months. This is laid out in the federal statute. So the QRTP work group that we talked about, this is one of the pieces they've been working on. in conjunction with our services continuum work group for how this is going to work. And it's going to be sort of a laundry list. I think that there's some idea, some QRTPs are going to be able to provide it because folks are local. They are working on partnerships between different facilities to be able to provide some of the aftercare services. There's a lot of work going on with the RAIs in different, parts of the state to maybe help, maybe they can help with some of the aftercare services for our youth that are eligible for Medicaid. Some things may have to be provided by the department. I mean, it's going to be kind of a laundry list, but there is a group working on this that has county involvement as well as some others to make this more clear and make it really, clear what options are available for who and how you do it. So that is our.
I was actually, Ashley, I just want to add one last thing to the last slide. So thinking about this as county attorneys, this is obviously going to be a heavy lift for our clients, right? There's a lot here. So obviously the state's going to give some guidance, but each of your counties are going to figure out how to do this, how to say what are the long-term goals, what are the short-term goals. We're going to have this qualified individual assessor who comes in at the beginning and lays out some really nice things for us, but they're not coming back to reassess. Right. So I think that's a piece that you guys are going to have to learn how your counties are going to do things. Some counties are talking about continuing to do the cans themselves as a way to measure, is it time to leave? Some counties may not do that or may not have the resources to do that. So I think that's an important piece for all of us as county attorneys, is to figure out how our counties are going to approach this ongoing assessment and decision making within the counties themselves.
And there is some talk, I'm so glad you pointed that out, Jen, that maybe the QRTP facility themselves may do ongoing assessment utilizing the cans as well. So I think, again, it may depend on where you're at, how each county and or facility are going to deal with this, because I know some facilities are interested in doing that as well.
And I'm hopeful with one of the positives of COVID is it's opened up telehealth so much more, and that's going to stick around after COVID. So I think this discharge planning in some ways for our rural communities, or I should really say our non-metro communities, it may make more services accessible, which I think is one of the few positives I think we can take from this pandemic that we're all experiencing.
And I know that not all county relationships with their RAIs look the same. But I will say that there's been a level of conversation that people have not been able to have successfully before between RAIs and counties and states. So I do think that the integration of systems working together through Families First work is improving. And so that we might see some improvement in our ability to kind of utilize some of those regional agencies and things like that too, which will be nice.
Yep. All right, so it's 1:58. So I think we were Ashley. Our next slide.
Let's go. That was impressive. Would love to have any last questions that people want to throw at us or things to think about. I think Jen mentioned at the beginning, we're training on this now and we don't have an implementation date yet, but it's because, we want people to really have an understanding of this process and how it plays out. We're going to train on this more than one time, as different pieces get added in, but this bench card will be a tool that we can all use together that I think will really help in the process. Once we're ready, us folks in the court will be trained, we'll be ready. And hopefully the process will be relatively seamless.
That's very optimistic.
I know, right? I have to be optimistic.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions. So I would just really encourage everyone to reach out to myself or Ashley. Ashley is obviously living and breathing this every single day, and I probably know enough to be dangerous. So I will keep Ashley in the loop with any questions you guys have for us. But we appreciate your time and joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.